Give it a few minutes for some more folks to join. While people are rolling in, feel free to put your name on the attendees list and feel free to put your name on the attendees list. And if there's anything on the agenda that you wanted to add, feel free to add it on the agenda as well. And we'll give it another few minutes. All right, we can probably get started, and then as folks roll in, yeah, anyway, so just as a reminder, this meeting's being recorded and it'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly thereafter. And also this meeting, your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF code of conduct. All right, so we don't have much of an agenda today because I know a lot of stuff has been happening with Thanksgiving and in the US. And so, but anyway, before kind of getting into the one agenda item, which is on the Fresca pipeline framework, and other folks feel free to add stuff there, and also feel free to add your attendance to the document. Is there anybody sort of new to the group who wants to introduce themselves? Okay. So we can get started. Actually, before getting into the Fresca pipeline framework, was there any other sort of agenda items or anything else that folks wanted to sort of bring up? Any updates or anything like that? All right. Okay. So we can get into it. So the Fresca pipeline framework, which I'll share some stuff shortly. That's what I'm going to be talking about at the Open Source Summit Japan next week. Right, next week. Yeah. We'll be talking about the Fresca pipeline framework, and give me a second just to pull up a couple of the diagrams here, still finishing up the slides here, but give me 1 second. All right. And once again, these slides are still in they're work in progress, so don't over-index on them too much. But so one of the big things that we had sort of been discussing in the Fresca group was the need to make the pipelines sort of easier. So as a reminder to folks who are not super familiar with not super familiar with how Fresca is doing some of these things today, is we are using Q to deploy out to the underlying tools that make up Fresca, right? Things like the supporting tools like Tecton Chains, HashiCorp Vault, and a bunch of these other tools. And one of the things there, right, is that's been brought up a few times is, if folks have, let's say, just a Tecton or some other CI setup, it can often be very difficult to orchestrate multiple sort of Kubernetes resources at the same time when you're running like a pipeline or you're deploying a new pipeline. So that was sort of where this pipeline framework came into play. And so actually, if I go back a slide, and I apologize for the color scheme, I'll try and fix that. But the idea here is right, if you look at stuff like Salsa, there's a lot of stuff that is, there are different responsibilities for the different groups within, there's different responsibilities based on the build service versus what the actual user-defined build pipeline is. Actually, let me just have that. Right, like stuff that's in blue, right? Like the fact that you have a scripted build is part of the end user's build responsibility. A build service is part of the build service responsibility, but certain things like build as code is kind of a combination of the responsibilities, because one is the build service needs to actually be able to look at that build pipeline as code and be able to interpret it. But the actual end user needs to know like how to actually write that thing. And the same thing when it goes to sort of like the provenance pieces, right? These are shared responsibilities, right? Because you need to be able to enable sort of the functionality to actually, you need to use something, the end user needs to be able to use a tool that generates provenance, but also needs to ensure that the build service needs to actually then build that provenance. So there's a bunch of different shared responsibilities here, which then leads to why you might want to use something like a framework that can help sort of abstract away a lot of that other stuff, right? Because today, when, one of the things that's come up a few times with just using Tecton normally, or just Tecton plus Tecton chains, is as soon as you start to include other third, like external services, it's up to the end user to figure out how that's going to work and figure out how that's going to get set up when a new pipeline is loaded in. And so that's kind of where, something like a pipeline framework would help out here, right? Where you imagine, Fresca, the whole point of Fresca is not just Tecton plus Tecton chains and plus Vault. It's two main things. It's a build service that is configured to be secure, and then it's also a set of these abstractions on top of it, so that when you run your builds, right, the stuff that is under the end user's responsibility, right, the developer who's deploying their, who wants to run their code, can't do bad things. Like they can't, let's say, hey, if an SBOM step is required to actually generate an SBOM, and your pipeline does not generate an SBOM, that's not a valid Fresca pipeline. That's the sort of thing that we're trying to kind of go through here. And so, from kind of going from the top down, right, the idea here is the stuff that's in green is stuff that's under Fresca's responsibility, right? So we want to have a shared library of functionality, like, stuff that like here are abstractions to sort of enforce the use of different security tools or different security, different security steps, different security tasks, those sorts of things. Then the Fresca config itself is stuff like, here are the secure defaults. So this is like the baseline. And so the baseline, and we're still sort of thinking through this as a team here. And we're obviously interested in getting more feedback, more contributions, and so on. But the basic idea behind it is, you might imagine there might be a baseline template, a baseline pipeline, right? That itself is not a full-fledged pipeline, but it's essentially, an abstraction that says all pipelines must have a source pull-down step, a security linting step, a build step, a security scanning step, an SBOM step, and a publishing step, like something like that. And then, okay, cool. Well, then if you use any tasks that are correctly tagged or correctly signed off as being, an appropriate SBOM step, an appropriate source code ingestion step or whatever, you get to use that inside of your pipeline. And so then, like, for organizations, right, and for folks who've worked at large organizations, you probably know what I'm talking about here, right, where an organization might want to have some level of constraints in policy and governance, right? So an organization might say, hey, our company only, by policy right now, we only are a Python and Go shop, right? We don't support Rust. We don't support these other things. So if somebody comes in with a bunch of Rust builds, sorry, that's not a valid pipeline. And then, an individual department might want to further constrain, right, for its own governance and its own policy, right? A department might say, hey, actually, we're only, our department only writes Go. And so if somebody comes in with something else, even something like Python that's allowed at the organization level, we still don't want to allow that within our department. And then some simpler things are just things like, right, you can imagine a naming scheme, right? An organization might say, hey, all of our pipeline should be prefixed with org X, and then the department might say, okay, then after that initial thing should be dash department X or department, whatever, and then team and project and so on. But then, an individual team might say, hey, we're actually only running on Go 118 and above, right? We require generics or whatever. Okay, cool. Your team can then constrain that. And then the idea here is we want to make it as simple as possible for the actual developer to say, hey, I just want to fill out a very basic YAML, a very basic TUML, whatever config, and just have something like, where does my code live? What is the email address of where reports and yada yada should go to? What's the team name or whatever? What's the project name? And what should the resultant artifact be named, right? Imagine, there's 5 or 6 things. And then if those 5 or 6 things are sort of defined, you just get a pipeline that's based on not quite inheritance, but as a combination of sort of inheritance and composition of all the configuration that's above it, right? And so the project, so for the end user, right, the end user shouldn't need to necessarily modify a whole bunch of stuff themselves. And in fact, you probably want to constrain it where you only want to give end users a few things for, and once again, this is purely for the secure pipeline, right? Like, this is not saying like, hey, if folks have their own custom builds they need for certain feature things and yada yada, okay, that's fine. But if they need stuff that's like, hey, we need a secure build with salsa provenance, with following, stuff like NIST SSDF and following, the new S2, or sorry, that's more of a consumption framework, but like all the things that we need to sort of show some of the stuff, like we want to make sure that folks can't break that. And one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of is folks have been able to break it. Folks, all it takes, right, is with even some of the GitHub stuff, right, is for an admin on the project to just sort of remove something or change something, and then you're not exactly sure anymore, like, is this actually, well-formed salsa, or is it, not? So that's some things there. And then the stuff on the left-hand side are the security constraints and infrastructure constraints. So these are things like just at the org level that might be some additional things that an individual department might not necessarily define, but like a separate department, like your security, department might define certain things like, hey, all tasks must be signed, or I only allow images. Like if you define an image in a task, it must come from our internal registry, not an external registry, right? Things like that you might want to have defined at every level. And the same thing goes with like infrastructure, right? Where you might say, hey, look, your task seems to indicate that it's asking for $1 million worth of infrastructure per build. We're not going to allow that kind of thing. So that's kind of where, abstractly what we're trying to do with this pipeline framework. And then what it actually does here at a level down, right, is the idea here is to eventually have something like a Fresca CLI tool that can deploy into Fresca, which would take this configuration and generate the deployable YAML. And so right now we're doing this with some Qlang, the language. So we're currently doing that, and I'll show off what some of that looks like in a couple of seconds here. But the main thing is we are trying to take all of that configuration, and once again, the stuff that's in green would be owned by, or sorry, is under the responsibility of Fresca itself, and the stuff that's in orange is the sort of organization, or the user of Fresca, the deployer of Fresca's responsibility, right? Where you can imagine here, once again, there's a shared library and framework that sort of says, here's how you write pipelines, and we are taking the opinionated stance here of, here's the right way to deploy pipelines, right? There's a lot of ways to sort of say, generally, here are the best practices, but we wanted to say, here's how those best practices are actually implemented in something like Fresca. And so if folks need something super custom, yeah, right now, at least, Fresca is not the thing for them. But if they say, hey, we don't necessarily, we don't know the best ways to operate this, we don't know, yada, yada, we just want, I just have a Go build that uses build packs. Can I just run that and run that securely? And the idea, the goal here should be, yes. And so we ingest the sort of shared library and framework, and then you have the stuff like the organization config and upwards. And then you also have, this idea of, vendor dependencies, where those vendor dependencies could be, stuff like upstream Tecton tasks from the Tecton catalog that you just sort of included in your local library, that then can get used by your Q code. Once again, I'll show that in a second. And then all of this sort of gets ingested into the Fresca tooling, which right now is just some Q scripts. But all of that Q can then generate multiple Kubernetes YAMLs, and then generate automatically from a single sort of pipeline definition, generate stuff like the tasks, the pipelines, stuff like, Keyverno policies, config maps, monitoring, secrets, all that good stuff. Parth?
Yeah, so quick question for the organizational config and user config. So is that going to be in Q itself, or is that going to be something easier for the, for the user itself to write? Is it a YAML, or what kind of format is that in?
So most likely, at least for now, and this is, once again, this is just purely the POC I've been sort of writing up. And right now we've been using Q for the organizational config as well as the user config. Most likely we want to move to something like, we want to make sure that the user config, if a developer comes in, if they just want to use just the normal Go pipeline that either the organization has defined or Fresca has defined itself. Like if your organization says, hey, we're just going to use all the Fresca defaults, and there's a Fresca default secure Go pipeline that does salsa and does all the, generates SBOMs and all that good stuff. Hey, great. All you need is just to fill in some YAML, TUML, something like that. Probably YAML, just to be clear. I just, but I'm open to, I think we're open to other options. However, if you have other things like, hey, I have a custom naming scheme that I want it to be generated by the queue, right? Then yeah, you can do it via then you would have to use Q. We want to still make it simple, right? We don't want to say, because we want to say that the baseline that's defined by Fresca is rigorous enough that, yes, you still need to learn Q to, let's say, make something super custom, but you're not going to have to shoot yourself in the foot understanding all the intricacies and whatever for Q in most cases. But the idea here should be that we make stuff as simple as possible, where even if you have to dive into Q, it shouldn't be that complicated. Brendan?
Yeah, so looking at this, I'm thinking along the lines of, we've got two different options there. One is that you can do all the enforcement, everything as part of the Q configuration, the pipeline building itself. And the other is that you could potentially enforce it downstream from that, in terms of an emission controller or something like that, that's looking at, did I get assigned SBOM from this? And so I'm wondering, have we considered both sides of that? And does it make sense that Fresca is only on the pipeline building versus the downstream emission controller verifying it?
So yeah, actually that's a good point. So one of the things here, and I know I have it up in this sort of diagram, right, was the idea would be to do it at both levels, right? One is you sort of enforce policy at deploy time, like almost, I know it's not actually, when you do the queue stuff, you're not actually compiling, but it's sort of like, hey, at build time of the policy, right? When the policy gets transformed from queue into the resultant YAML, one of the things that we also want to make sure of is we want to make sure that, hey, that config that you're generating should have all the right hooks to automatically generate the runtime admission policy as well. So you get it both ways, right? Where one is, hey, as a developer who's just sort of writing some stuff, oh, I get told this is not going to deploy because it's not going to match the thing. But then even if, let's say, I'm nefarious and I go in and I say, ooh, I somehow got access directly to the cluster, I want to be able to sort of deploy something. Well, no, because the pipeline, the policies for those pipelines should have already been configured, and it should notice like, wait a second, this pipeline doesn't match the emission control piece and gets blocked there. So it is also a defense in depth approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that.
Does that also apply to the build images and so forth, right? You want to enforce like, hey, the images that I'm using for the build are also signed, maybe contain an SBOM, have attestations and so forth, right? So it's not just during the going to production or something, but it's actually doing the build also.
Yeah, so I think the thing would be like, there's certain things we can do with Q, and like this is the same thing I think with, if you look at like TF-lint and some of these other various like security tools for linting infrastructure as code, you still want to have like runtime policy, but you also want to have almost like build time policy so that you can tell the developer, hey, look, because I know as somebody who's run into this a million times with stuff like Terraform, right? You run a Terraform deploy, right? Because the Terraform plan worked and yada yada, but the deploy somehow it triggers some sort of like weird constraint really, really deep in. And it's like, oh, it turns out the runtime policy doesn't allow you to run this sort of thing. And so that sort of thing is kind of what we're also trying to protect against is yeah, we want to make it simple, right? And then in fact, we probably also want to have in this sort of Fresca tooling set, like things that can help do it for you, right? Because I can imagine a world, right, where when you're running the build locally, you might be using, the latest for, the latest tag. Okay, great. But when using the latest tag, we might have some tooling that says, well, hold on, that's not going to be allowed. You need to pin to a hash, but do you want to pin to the hash right now? Right. And we'll sort of take that latest and replace it with, whatever, right? Which I know comes with its own, set of things, like if you haven't actually scanned that image or whatever, but like these are the sorts of things I think would be useful, or things like in the Fresca tooling that might say, hey, look, we checked those images and those images aren't signed, right? So before, like this would not, like if you go to deploy this in, it's not going to run because when the next time it runs, Kyverno or whatever policy is going to go and block it from running. Does that make sense?
Would that policy enforcement be kind of we evaluated on a per build basis?
So so there's two pieces to it. One is like the runtime policy, at least there's two pieces to it. There's stuff that's going to be at deploy time. Like there's going to be certain things that you can actually say, hey, I expect all Tecton tasks that get uploaded to look like this. And if it doesn't have like a hash at the end, it's not pinned to a hash or whatever, then I'm not going to let it through. And then there's also going to be stuff at the pipeline run as well, that as different resources get spun up, it might say, hey, so certain things might not get caught, at least based on the different features of the different policy engines. Like it might get caught at different levels. But one of the things like that I can imagine is, at least right now, something like you deploy in without a hash, oh, that gets blocked by even when you try to deploy the task in, or you try to deploy the pipeline in, right? There's no hash associated, or sorry, no digest associated with that image or whatever. You haven't pinned to the digest. But then I can imagine when you go to do the actual at runtime, like there's a lot of stuff in Kyverno that just makes it very easy to say, hey, was this signed with SigStore, by a key that I trust? And if so, let it through. If there's no key associated with it, or if it's not signed with a key I trust, don't allow this, container to run. And that's more of the actual sort of like the pipeline run piece that it would block it at.
Right. I mean, I guess I'm just don't know enough the actual flow here end to end. I'm just thinking a scenario whereby you have a policy version 1 now, and you have everything is compliant, and then you change that policy to version 2, and somebody rerun a pipeline that was previously run. I'm just thinking like scenario, does that version 2 get enforced, and therefore you have a compliance build that is up to date to the latest policy?
Yeah, I think that's kind of where we need to do some thinking around it, because that is something that we've also been thinking is something like a versioned Fresca pipeline. And the version Fresca pipeline is the versioning is also associated with the general governance and policy. So you could go back and say, hey, like you've deployed V2, you've deployed V2 of the policy, but you're still running the V1 pipeline. And there might be something along, and this is where some stuff like runtime authorization might come into play of, hey, if like the way that we probably want to do it, and this is going to take some thinking, is do it sort of like how Google does their binary authorization. Like you sort of say, all pipelines are allowed, unless there's like a critical thing that needs to shut everything down, unless there's something really critical, all pipelines are allowed to run for 2 weeks, and then they're reevaluated against the same policy.
Right.
Against the new policy. And so, you might get an alert to say, hey, you need to rerun this against that new thing. Yes, and reproducible builds and immutable pipelines. Yeah, so the idea here is, yeah, we do want to make these pipelines themselves immutable. And we also recognize that when it comes to some of this stuff, like when it comes to reproducible, and I think that's, oh no, that's not in, I think I took it out here because in that requirement's being removed for it's been removed. But anyway, reproducible builds is also important. The problem is, reproducible builds is more on the end user to sort of give code that
it's a shared problem.
Yeah, it's a shared problem to the point where like you want to make sure you have an environment that could run a reproducible build. At the same time, the majority of the burden is on the end user to make sure that their code is, doesn't have a lot of random stuff in there and timestamps and so on. But yeah, that's kind of like, once again, that's the ideal. And for cases where that's happening already, stuff like, Fresca just makes it easy to say, yep, this is reproducible, and I can provide you the provenance to say that, like, look, like it ran in this ecosystem. So if you run it somewhere else, you can, and you run it in a different ecosystem or whatever, you have an idea of like, hey, if it doesn't reproduce on a different ecosystem, okay, well, either, and it's still running the same stuff. The idea behind Fresca as well is to say, hey, well, Fresca is doing more or less the right things, we think, which means that there could be a bug somewhere in Fresca that is breaking that sort of thing, or in the other ecosystem you might be rebuilding it in, there could be an issue there. Cool. So let me see. And so now let me show a little bit of the queue stuff. Give me 1 second. And once again, this is all very much like POC at this point. So it's not really intended to be whoops. That was not what I wanted to do. And is it this one? Yes. So a lot of this is familiar to some folks who have already been working with Fresca, who have used the examples, and just to kind of give an idea here of what it currently looks today, just in the examples folder, right, is I might have a build packs, pipeline, right? And so a lot of the actual elements of this pipeline are abstracted. And in fact, there's elements of like the build packs task, which is just, whoops, not that one. Let me close this. It's under the vendor, right? Where we actually pull in the pipeline tasks, .yaml. So like the build packs.yaml as the pipeline task, but it actually gets referred to in the queue. And then like the inputs for the actual pipeline are a combination of things that could be generated, right? Like defaults, right? So you could imagine for like the end user, hey, I can maybe use the defaults, right? Like if I don't care about where some of the stuff goes or some of the naming, I'm just going to use the defaults here. And so this gets pulled in, but the idea here as well is there's also a bunch of stuff in the examples.q, which are other helpers, right? So hey, the repository for where you're pushing the image, right? So given that a lot of this stuff is still, dev, we push to ttl.sh for a lot of our testing and demos and dev work, right? For the dev version, for the local dev version of Fresca, we use Gidia to actually, include code. So instead of needing access to Git or whatever, we'll go out and we'll essentially, clone down to a local repository, which makes it easier to do stuff like test out the Tecton triggers and those sorts of things, and stuff like that. The other things that like in the examples here, right, is if I look at gripe, right, right, so we have like a gripe task that's defined pretty much completely here inside of Q. Right. And this allows us to sort of parameterize it in good ways. It allows us to also share a lot of the data across multiple things. So stuff like data that's defined in one pipeline can be referred to in a task, can be referred to in a config map, can be referred to in a policy. And it makes it really nice because like normally you'd have to go in and there are different various Kubernetes config, tools out there, but I found this one to be very, very useful and very, very, it's not the easiest to use, but for this particular use case, it seems to be really nice in being able to share that, be able to refer to different variables in different places in order to be able to do things like not quite inheritance, but more like, you can sort of take something that is at a like that is just a set of constraints, right? Like you might say, hey, this is an integer. And then you might say, hey, the constraint is this integer should be over 18. And then the final actual sort of data could be something like 35. And it's like, oh, yes, that matches the schema. We're going to let that go through. And so what's also nice about it as well is if I actually look at some of the other helpers we have here, right, is one of the nice things about Q is Q can actually just by as table stakes here in its functionality, it can actually enforce the constraints on Kubernetes resources and custom resources. So you can actually say like, well, this should be a pipeline run, and so all of our pipeline runs should fill out the boilerplate around API version, metadata, kind, etc. Right? And integrate with whatever else is passed in, right? So if somebody tries to override the API version, isn't allowed. If somebody, were to try to change the kind, not allowed because this is already a concrete value. The generated name here, right, for the metadata is, either a variable that gets passed in over here, or it's just any other string. And the thing here is like, if somebody passes in a number, hey, that doesn't match the schema, I'm not going to go in and deploy that. And so the thing here, right, is this would still would not go through on Kubernetes. Kubernetes would say, hey, you didn't match the custom resource definition. But often when you're deploying out like 20 or 30 YAMLs at once, it gets really confusing as to what exactly went wrong where. And this helps out there. And so, I'm able to put, we're able to pull in Kyverno custom resources, general Kubernetes resources, Tecton custom resources, and so on. And so anytime there's a new custom resource that we might want to add because we've included a new tool inside of Fresca, that just kind of comes in here and we get that like schema validation included. And so then when we start to look at like what this might look like in the future, as we start to build this as an actual library, you might imagine, hey, the baseline, there might be a baseline. The baseline here might be, and once again, I'm still working on getting the actual pipeline set up, the pipeline scaffolding set up here. But you can imagine here, like, okay, well, all pipelines must include these inputs, right? And this hashtag just means it's also closed. So this could be like, hey, these are the only inputs allowed into a pipeline. Or you can go and, if I had it something like this, it means like, hey, you can include additional inputs if you wanted to as well. But the thing that's nice here is like, okay, cool. I know that these are the inputs that must be, that these are the only outputs that are allowed, right? And if I go into what like a build packs might look like here, right, is, hey, I'm importing elements of the other like helper libraries to now define what my pipeline is going to look like, right? And so I'm able to go in and say, okay, well, I'm going to override, and once again, we're still don't over-index on the syntax right now. We're still working on what the, making the syntax much easier. But the idea here is, okay, great. We want to change the name of the image to example build packs. Like that's what we want to fill in, right? And we have some additional sort of things that we just want to kind of create for here. And then, okay, then this is what comes out of there. And if I wanted to do, if I did, right, if I did qvet, right, if it would give me errors if it had any issues, but I can do like a qeval, which exports out the JSON output here. Oh, sorry, not the JSON output, the Q output that qeval will tell you like whether or not there are any values that haven't been actually realized by, are like, do you still have an empty string in here, right? Like I can go and, if I were to, let's say, comment out this and just do, right, what you'll see here is, under the app image, I might have broken something, but yeah, I'll fix that in a little bit. But the basic idea behind it is this lets you sort of go in and yeah, so that's all right. Yeah, that's the image. And then if I go back up here, you'll see the cache image, it just says string. So that means it hasn't been realized. And I think if I do qeval-c, and once again, the idea is to create some tooling to make it easier to recognize, or it might be qvet-c. I don't remember the exact command off the top of my head, but there's ways to go in and say like, okay, great. Like if you know a parameter is missing, this will tell you, and will help out here. And so the idea longer term, right, is, so we have, using Q, we have the ability to then take all of this data and convert it into YAML. And so if I do, well, actually, I'm not going to run that right now because it takes a little while, but we can convert it into the actual YAML using sort of Q as well. And so then you just get a bunch of Q that you can then pipe into, and if I look actually over here, you'll see one of the commands we run, which is
check the setup.
Yeah, setup. That's right. Thanks. Where is it?
Q command.
Oh yeah, here we go. So you can run something like this, right? And so the Q command running apply turns it into YAML, and then we can pipe that into kubectl apply to actually deploy out into the thing there. So if I actually, I don't know if this will work. Actually, if I share, if I stop sharing this and I move over to my original thing here. Second. If I share, is this one? Yeah. So if I go here, oh. And I go and I go back to the examples here and look at the build packs, look at the setup, right? One of the things I can do is I can just do something like repository equals foo, and I do apply. Whoops, I have to actually go into this command. So,
CD.
Yep. Right, you can see it generated all the sort of actual Kubernetes YAML from just the configuration that's defined here, because it's able to import in all the extra stuff like the, other external YAMLs, the other Q stuff, and so on. And so what this really allows us to do as well, which is also one of the other key things we want to get out of this, is we want to make it super simple so that if somebody does go to a V2 of a thing, right? One of the things we've seen a million times before is you go to, V2 of a pipeline definition, right? Because everybody must have, an SBOM and blah, blah, blah. And you go and you say, well, great, now we want to have a new, whatever, a new sort of security step. But then you have to go and sort of update, 1,000 other pipelines to now include that other step. Whereas here, the idea is like, okay, well, now you just define it one place and then you just deploy it out everywhere. And so that's kind of one of the big things that I think we want to work on starting next year in earnest, because we believe that sort of thing to be, really important, because we think that at least right now is we have a lot of good stuff inside of Tekton itself with Spiffy Spire, with Vault, with all the other components that running this thing securely. The thing that we keep hearing is, as people are trying to poke around with this and saying like, okay, what happens when we actually want to make Fresca into something that's releasable? Well, it's not very easy to use for the end user. Like creating a pipeline right now means you have to write a lot of Q, or you need to create all of those individual YAMLs yourself. And so we want to make it really, really, really simple for the end user to do that, right? Where, hey, if you're a simple developer, you just get something like some YAML and everything else just gets generated for you and you don't need to think about it. If you're, let's say, somebody who's managing some of the pipelines, okay, cool. Yeah, now you need to dive into Q a little bit. You need to modify some things here and there, but we provide helper libraries and we provide enough there so that you don't, inadvertently shoot yourself in the foot. And then finally, if you're like also a developer on Fresca itself, right? And Fresca now wants to include some new, like, hey, we've discovered, hey, there's this great, we want to, one of the things that we also want to look at next year is confidential containers. Hey, that requires also its own set of config in order to kind of get set up. And so we would love to be able to then just say, well, we could just include that confidential containers piece in the library. And if you include that new version of the library and you deploy out the new version of Fresca, you would just automatically get the ability to start using confidential containers without needing to do a whole lot of wiring yourself. So I know I just talked a lot, but any questions, comments, thoughts? talking meeting. Yeah, if there's nothing else, I don't know if anybody's going to be out. Is anybody going to be out in Japan next week?
Michael, I'll be there. It'd actually be great to hang out and talk more about this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I'll be out there. At least for I don't remember exactly what day I go to Tokyo for a few days, but yeah, I'll be there at least Monday, Tuesday, and I think Wednesday.
Okay. Yeah, in fact, we're doing kind of a 2-hour kind of mini OpenSSF day on Monday afternoon. So
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll be there.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And then I'm not sure yet. So I will probably not be able to also attend any of the meetings until the new year, just because I'm also going to be visiting the in-laws in the Philippines as well after Japan. So I won't be around. So if other folks wanted to still, join, feel free to the, Parth, Brendan, etc. If anyone wanted to facilitate the meeting. But yeah, I think it'll be, either 10 or 11 p.m. Over there. So it'll be a little late. Any other topics folks wanted to bring up, or anything else folks wanted to bring up?
So Maya, I don't know whether this is the right forum or the time, considering the time we have, about our attempt to package Fresca using Helm, and probably ask Brandon for his input, because I see a lot of his work in there in the current Fresca kind of setup scripts and stuff.
What sort of questions?
Well, what we are trying to achieve at the moment is that we want to be able to say deploy Fresca to a cluster, right? And we need a way to package stuff and a unit, right, handed to a user as consumer, for example, right? This is the package, these are the steps that you want to run. And from my perspective, when I look at the current Fresca, there are a lot of scripts and stuff, right? Which works perfectly, but when you hand it to an end user, or that could be a lot of moving pieces, right? That somebody changed certain things starting to break, that kind of thing. So I was wondering whether we can or should package it with the Helm chart, for example, which is more kind of K8, common, right? For as far as packaging stuff. And I know there are a lot of interdependency between stuff, and therefore we need to do a lot of kubectl patches. Just wondering, trying to get your input around what do you think about that idea of packaging using Helm, and do you see that working, or what are the things that if we were to go that path to be aware of?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of ordering between the steps that we run. And so if you try to run it in Helm, Helm's just used to rendering all the templates and applying all the templates at once. And so I don't know if there's a good way to kick off all the scripts and do things in order when you do it in Helm.
Right. Yeah. One thing I'm trying to kind of get around that is using the lifecycle hook, and but you can only do so much. And then I'm starting to thinking about do we need some sort of a controller, or a post deployment kind of a cron job pod that does something like that, but it's getting a bit intrusive, right, to people's kind of runtime.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of patching in there just so that we can use vendoring rather than trying to pull down someone, rather than maintain our own fork of whatever the upstream repo has on something. And so there's a lot of things that get complicated when you try to move it into a Helm chart, which is designed to really do that in a whole different way. It's designed that you pull the whole thing in, you template out all your changes in there, and
Right.
pass them as values, where the decisions we made was because we didn't have Helm. And so it might
Right.
completely redesign how some of those decisions were made if you had the Helm, had the templating, and weren't depending on having the upstream YAML file vendored in as is without modifying it.
Right. Yeah, and then with that, and also thinking about are there alternatives with that? Like, so we don't have to like ship, for example, like a shell script, right? Like, and be more like a package. I mean, Q is one thing I was thinking, like, done all this YAML, killed it, but then, you know, when you upgrade and whatnot, that can be a lot of work, right?
Yeah, Q is good for validating, and it's good if what you have is written in Q and you're turning it into YAML. It's not as good to take something in YAML and extend it.
I guess I'm rather new to Fresca, and you know, you obviously know a lot more like the intricacy between components. I would definitely take your input as to whether this is even possible, or like, you know, as a rabbit hole that we go down with Ham, or like, or what other alternatives or framework that we should be looking at.
Yeah. Yeah, I gotten pinged by Tim on this one, I think last week or so.
All right.
And
Yeah,
technically
sorry.
I'm out this week, but if you want to chat next week, I'm more than
Mhm.
happy to sit down and go over some of the thoughts on that.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Ping me
Doug.
on any of the Slacks. I'm
Yeah.
everywhere.
Cool. Thank you.
Is there anything else? Otherwise, we can sort of end it 8 minutes early.
I'm just about to drop an issue in here. I noticed that when I changed some versions in vendor code, our script that runs the vendoring doesn't clean up old versions.
Oh, okay.
So if anybody wants to pick that one up, that's a small issue. I think we just need to run an RM before you do the vendor me, and
Yep.
problem solved.
Okay. Cool. All right. So I probably won't see you guys you folks till the new year, but yeah, I'll still be around on Slack if folks have any questions or thoughts or anything like that. Just might be a little slow to respond depending on what time it is.
Enjoy Japan.
Yep. Thanks. Later, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.